right, Nathan. So I'm glad you're able to join me today because we've actually had a number of really high profile food safety issues. Certainly a big part of the supply chain that have come up in past issues here on Art of Supply. So I want to start before we dig into solving them. I actually want to learn a little bit more about what you currently do. How do those food safety issues connect to what WorkForge does?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, our current focus is really around frontline workers. So that would be people, involved in production, operators, people in maintenance. Generally that's about, 60% of what's happening at a food manufacturing plant. And, we're really helping them to obtain and maintain knowledge in areas like food safety. And we have a number of really, really great subject matter experts that we work with on a regular basis. Just as we're consistently surveying the market, talking with clients, just looking for those additional needs and looking to respond quickly, both to changes in the food safety
Yeah.
regulatory space, but also just responding to what we hear from our clients as well. We really think about it through the lens of helping an employee, with that knowledge base. So we have lots of different areas of focus, and food safety being a really really heavy one, a really really critical one that of course happens with all new employees, happens really in a food safety culture, on a regular basis, on an
Yeah.
annual basis at the minimum at organizations. And we really preach this hire to retire concept, for employees, where we're really looking at the convergence of skill acquisition. That'd be a lot of technical skills, and kind of the valuable experience that they gain while they're working to create a really highly productive employee that they're really seeking to retain, especially in a really stringent kind of low unemployment environment that really for food manufacturers existed for really a really long time. So.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure, you talk about that productivity on certainly an individual worker level, but the whole team kind of coming together. I have to think that the balance between productivity and safety is a little bit of something, not quite of a pendulum swing, because you never want to be either way in one direction or the other, but a little bit of give and take. Is that something that's hard to systematize, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it? Not that you want people making trade-offs between safety and efficiency, but when you're rolling this information out or even setting objectives at the client level, figuring out how those different things connect together, how big of a challenge is that?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the role to some degree. So, the idea of skill acquisition, has to do with a lot of things, right? And you could classify skills a lot of different ways. Again, that could be, just understanding regulatory and compliance type information all the way through
Right.
things that have to do with welding, pneumatics, hydraulics, other areas, right? Or, even things that are durable, like communication skills, for example. So I think a lot of it has to do with how you create and support, various career pathways,
Hmm.
for different employee types. And I think that's where a lot of the real detailed magic happens, because what we've really kind of seen, I think, and this is not just specific to this industry, but there's a tilt towards kind of a one size fits all approach, in particular around learning and development and
Yeah.
skill acquisition, skill maintenance. And so with the way that digital tools are now unleashing quite a bit of power, whether they're AI driven or not, there's a lot of opportunity to really create these career pathways, these learning pathways with positions in mind or even people in mind. And at the end of the day, that ties out really to the objectives of the organization, ties out to the specific skills that somebody might need, really in order to support, what's happening, at a plant level,
Yeah.
or at an organizational level. And so I think the real challenge and the opportunity there that maybe is net new, and it's going to sound maybe a little bit old school, but I think a lot of technology organizations like ourselves kind of want to park, a technology solution at somebody's door, and then kind of not support it very well. And what we've heard really loud and clear from working with our food manufacturers is that they want ongoing support, and they're
Okay.
looking for the updates on what's going on with our content, how to better use the system, how to better deploy it, how to reap the information that they need in order to run their operation, how to plug it in their HRIS so they have the artifacts that they need from an audit perspective. There's just a lot to be done here. So you can really create a kind of robustness, and you can help to scale a really important part of the operation by bringing together some really important tools that fall into learning and development.
Yeah. Now, I think you touched on this briefly, but I want to come back around and really focus on it. What is the current state of labor availability, training, skill sets in food production in the US?
Pretty challenging. It's been challenging for a lot of years.
Mm,
The individuals that are available, I think, to take the jobs, and I think the constructs have changed. It kind of ebbed and flowed over the last few decades, depending on just sort of the population and who's available in the workforce. But primarily you're talking about again, 60% of that workforce being producers, operators, maintenance type personnel. And so knowing that there's been maybe a lack of emphasis in the United States around these types of jobs. Maybe they haven't necessarily been the most attractive jobs in
mhm.
people's minds, and that kind of goes back, I think, into the broader manufacturing discussion around maybe dirty, dangerous jobs, right? And then I think there's also a layer around just sort of like a little bit of mystery. There's the education component, the learning and development component. These kind of jobs, maybe I don't know a lot about them. I don't have a lot of context for them. How am I going to learn what I need to learn?
Right.
How am I gonna be supported over a long-term career? Because I think, again, a lot of people think about these types of roles and they think of them not necessarily as temporary, but maybe short term, or maybe
Mm,
not without a lot of additional career growth opportunity. And that's just not the case. There's just a lot of opportunity here in these roles, and many of them are really, really pay quite well. So the dynamics are there. I think the focus of attention, the maybe the perceived attractiveness of these roles has been lacking for a while. And,
mm,
it's kind of interesting when you think about how food manufacturers, and I'd say this is all manufacturers too, by the way, how they have to attract workforce, kind of get, people on the radar. And, we've had some really big food manufacturers talk about sort of their approach to creating sustainability within how they recruit and how they
absolutely.
hire, because it's really, really important. And so they're looking at multilingual populations, they're looking at immigrant populations, they're looking at part-time fractional employees, really trying to be super flexible. Maybe moms coming back to work because kids are going back to school part-time, LGBTQ plus community. They're really working very hard to look for these pockets of people that they can get from their communities that can be these kind of employees. There's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of work on the front end of that, which may be different than some other industries in terms of talent attraction and retention.
And that is interesting because I do hear that about a lot of different types of manufacturings, that there's either a perception that I'm going to go into this dark factory, or there's a perception that it's going to be an old school kind of work. When in fact, simply the efficiencies that are required for these operations to be competitive has made them very leading in terms of a technology automation kind of perspective. And so there is sort of an idea of what's required versus what is actually required. When I listen to you describe what these food producers are doing to find segments of people that are potential employees, to, assuming, alter their messaging and outreach to connect with these different groups, and then deploy those plans, that starts to sound like a lot of work. And so finding these people and the costs associated with, if there's turnover, how big of an issue is managing the cost of recruiting and retention for these food manufacturers?
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to the idea of I as a food manufacturer, as an employer, has to go out and find different areas of the population to attract people from. That implies a lot of configuration, a lot of very specific messaging, a lot of specific support. And I think a lot of it has to do with just the idea of how can I create a message and environment where people understand that they can be successful here. And I think that's one of the biggest things. Am I going to find people like me in this environment? Am I going to find support
Right.
mechanisms in this environment? Am I going to be able to ultimately find success here? Right. So, of course, all that really flips, I think, a lot of the discussion, which I think has been the case in a lot of industries. I don't think this is unique to manufacturing, food manufacturing, is the idea of, sort of costs versus investments. And,
Yep.
we don't really have, I think, a big challenge kind of understanding that in manufacturing that you have to have really good equipment, really advanced equipment. I think people forget, food manufacturing is technology. It's a technology driven industry.
Yeah.
And I think people sort of think of technology in this day and age as software, right? And that's certainly a part of it and a
Sure.
pivotal role here. But there's, these really, really cool machines. There's really these cool processes that have to be put in place, and people have to work and understand these skills and these technical components of the job that are technology in order to do well. So, again, if you think about the dynamics of what's going on in the world of maintenance, you talk to any manufacturer, food manufacturer, they're struggling to find
Yeah.
people who've got experience in maintenance. And so a lot of times they're pulling people from their frontline in other areas who might show a propensity or an interest, and they're willing to teach them, right? But there's a lot of concepts that go into learning that position, right? So recruiting is expensive.
Right.
Replacing people is expensive. Attracting and maintaining fractional part-time labor is expensive. Having the operational flexibility to have all of these things kind of fit together to make quota, is expensive. And then you think about the downstream effects of, okay, if you've got a lot of these different types of employee types, how do I keep them? How do I keep them here? How do I keep them trained? Because if they're really, really going to be here short time, then that's exposure to mistakes and errors, and then we get
Right.
things that have to do with risk to the business. So it's just a lot of things to consider. It's a lot of things to have to organize and maintain to keep the operation going.
So let's talk a little bit about that training, especially when it comes to food production. What kinds of information do companies have to make sure their employees have, certainly to keep themselves safe, right, around all of this technology and all the work that's going on, but also to make sure that the product that leaves that factory at the end of the day is safe for people to consume? What are the types of information that have to be available?
Sure. Yeah. Food employees, they got to know, how their role supports food safety in the first place, and they have to know it well enough to field, questions from inspectors, and that might be conducting line interviews while they're there visiting the facility for audit purposes. They need to know about, general personal hygiene as well
Mhm.
as just good manufacturing practices. They have to know their specific tasks, of course, and really improve the overall safety level of the food. My task is packaging, and that adds a physical barrier to contaminants. Or my task is cooking, and I have to make sure the product reaches specific time and temperatures. Or my task is sorting, and I have to remove any out of spec material that I might observe.
How much time and effort is put into, say, this is what you need to do because this is the proper way to do it, and why it's important, right? So I think even let's think about like a home cooking situation. Most of us know that any utensil that touches raw meat, for instance, is no longer going to be the same utensil that you take the final cooked piece of meat and put it onto the plate or the platter with, right? You're swapping out utensils because there's an exposure potentially to bacteria there. In a factory setting, how much emphasis is put on the why versus just this is what you should or should not do and sort of stressing that message?
Yeah, I mean, understanding the why is really important, and we certainly include that, in skills focused modules and machine specific content. Organizations, they really have to kind of lean, on their food safety culture. I think
Mm,
to really kind of build. To kind of build that environment, and I think a lot of times we think of that in sort of simplistic terms. It's sort of like, okay, to your point, here's the what, but there is the downstream understanding of impact, right? The understanding
right.
of the why. Why am I doing this thing? What is going to be the result of the set of things that I'm really needing to understand and do? And if I don't do it, what does that mean for the product? What does that mean for the consumer? What does that ultimately mean when it loops
Mm,
back around to the organization and to myself, right? And so, when you're thinking about building that food safety culture, which is, I think, has become sort of a more important view in the last 5 7 years for how you think about these things. The why part of it's really really important. For anybody in the organization, not just your
Yeah.
frontline people, but anybody who connects to the organization.
And some of it's overarching as opposed to specific instances. When I think of some of the stories around food safety gone very, very wrong, or even being non existent that I've covered here on Art of Supply, I mean, people get incredibly sick. There can be loss of life. And in many cases, when they go back and they dig or they do postmortem inspections, they're finding out that issues have been pervasive. Things have been happening for a long time. Lots of people had to walk past whatever bad set of circumstances or broken piece of equipment, in order to get to where it escaped the factory and started to harm people. As part of training, are there things that companies can do to both empower production employees to stop the line if something is wrong, or to have sort of that larger awareness? Like, don't just follow your exact steps, sort of have your eyes open. If you see something, say something. Does that end up being part of the training as well, or is that something more that draws from company culture?
I think both. So, really having a broad base of knowledge and, an ongoing incentive to, really continue to learn are important components of this. And, and, creating that broad base of knowledge is certainly impactful in terms of, connecting the dots on the what and the
Mhm.
why. And I think there is certainly a blending of, these skills and competencies, this knowledge that somebody has to obtain, but then also, what are the trigger points, what are the processes that are in place in the organization, that can and I think that's again where we kind of go back to food safety culture. What are the
Right.
expectations, right? What's the outcome we're looking for? Why is this important to the product? Why is this important to the organization? Why is it important to the consumer? Because understand connecting the competencies, the knowledge with the what and the why really kind of builds the full picture. And it also sits within the realm of, what are the expectations and how do I live up those expectations? But at the end of the day is really just it's a function. It's a function of where does quality sit within the
Yeah.
organization, its level of priority.
And do you tend to find that where quality sits or is owned or rolls up to in an organization tends to be the same place as safety? Or is it because safety is regulated, it's slightly different? Like, is one operational and one personnel driven, or do safety and quality very much tend to be managed hand in hand?
I mean, I think they're kind of managed hand in hand. You certainly have in some organizations people who are, fully responsible for that piece, and doing their audits, doing their overviews, doing their coaching, uh, collecting their artifacts, creating that food safety culture. But ultimately, if you're talking about a well-run organization, then you're talking about a 360-degree sort of approach to it and how the
Yeah.
employees are responsible and active participants. And I think that's one of the interesting things about kind of the concepts of training and learning development. A lot of people think this is a very passive sort of approach. I'm being I have to know this, and so I'm participating because I have to or I'm being told to. But really moving it from a passive approach to more of a proactive approach, that's where we get into things that have to do with the culture of an organization,
Right.
expectations around food safety, expectations around things like learning and development that go beyond food safety. And what is the culture? What is it we want our employees to embody on a day in and day out basis relative to continuous improvement? And let's not forget that continuous improvement in most manufacturing sits at the heart of a lot of what happens. How do we do it better? How do we achieve high levels of quality? How do we maintain that?
Mm.
And a big part of that is learning and development. A big part of that is how does that happen on a day in and day out basis?
Yeah. And I think that actually goes back to one of the comments you made earlier about the companies that you work with wanting you to stay involved. It's not as simple as, I don't know, what is the range of information that an individual needs to consume, right, to get that info in their brain so that they can then go work the job. It, as humans, it has to be reinforced, it has to be updated, it has to go back in, right? And so it is, whether because we're just trying to maintain the base level of understanding and competency, or because of continuous improvement, which of course every company wants, you can see where the learning and development journey, especially around safety, becomes one that is constantly needing to run in the background.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed.
Now, one of the other things we know about food production is that it's highly regulated. And yet, despite all of those regulations, right, things still go wrong. Clearly, regulation provides like a baseline that has to be met, and yet a company still has to be willing to go above and beyond that to not just meet expectations, but to hopefully have a competitive advantage in whatever category they are producing in. What do you see around where companies are looking for train us to the point of regulation versus, yes, we definitely need to cover this regulatorily required information, but we want to go past that? What's sort of the interplay between what regulations mandate or what audits ensure and what a company wants to go and do themselves above and beyond that?
Well, I think at a fundamental level, one could say the responsibility of, obtaining food safety always takes priority, over responsibility of, kind of reaching perfect food quality measurements. So, while you might be achieving food safety, critical points like temperature or pH, are necessary before, even considering other, product factors. So both
Mhm.
safety and quality factors have the, same immediate, plant level impact. So, if the product is unsafe, it doesn't ship. If the
Yeah.
product's out of spec, it also doesn't ship. And of course, the seriousness of a food safety problem is far higher than the seriousness of a food quality problem. But
Right.
both problems are going to result in a product, being put on hold, and then result in either rework or some kind of product discard, right? So it's a function of waste at that point. So I think primary difference involved in evaluating food safety and evaluating kind of food quality, is the level of flexibility in the two types of measurements, right? So you have food safety measurements, something like temperature, pH, is very very binary. Either passes or doesn't pass. And then
Right.
food safety measurement like texture or color or dimensions, those all involve kind of a range of acceptability. They have upper limits and lower limits, and many quality factors are considered possible if they're are not perfect, so long as the measurements still within the range of acceptability. So best practice is really to be certain
Yeah.
all food safety requirements are met. And then after that, certain to make sure that all quality measurements are, within the control limits, right? A product is only really released to ship after it's confirmed that they hit both kind of the baseline safety, but, also what are the quality measurement expectations of the product as well.
Yeah. Now, and this in some ways does come back to what you've said about company culture around safety and getting that message along. Because really, at the end of the day, it is the quality of the product that comes out that's either going to generate sales or not. And so connecting all of these things together so that the outcome or the effort can be measured in terms of revenue is important. What are some things that you've seen really successful companies do that are definitely investing in this training? They're focused on continuous improvement, they're investing in staffing, but they're also making sure that it's not just the exceptions, for instance, that get attention within the plant. It's reaching a new revenue level or indicators of growth or making sure that there is pride around the brand and the product that filters all the way back down to the production floor as maybe an added incentive beyond individual performance to make sure everybody really does have a reason to ensure that what they see going by them is right and looks right and is going to be good for the company to put into the market.
I mean, strong companies, they set really clear expectations, right? Clear explanations, in a way that invites discussion, conversation, promotes shared goals. Just kind of thinking through some of the primary bullets here. I think again, everything starts and ends with food safety. If you're in this environment, right? So first and foremost, this is how we need to do things. This is why it's important to follow protocols, kind of like we've talked about connecting the outcomes and seeing,
Yeah.
sort of the circle of life, so to speak. What's the what and the why and the downstream impact, and how does that all kind of come back through the ecosystem? Here are the great things that happen when we get this right. Remembering what's at stake. You even brought up asking for help, or when
Right.
is the opportunity to stop things because I've seen something, I've noticed something that's out of place or not right, and what's the culture, perhaps the incentive for doing that. we're all in this together. It is a team
Right.
environment. I think people forget about that, or probably don't realize that in manufacturing environment. There's so many people involved in how you're producing things, along the way, and that those connected pieces really are connected. And so they have to be communicating. People have to be communicating. They have to be problem solving together. And so that teamwork element's really, really important. And everyone here, at the plant has a duty to protect the products that we're sending out to the customer. Ultimately, you really have to think about it again, sort of circle of life.
Yeah.
What's my responsibility with what I'm doing in this part of the process? And when this product reaches, the consumer, what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
And again, not to kind of round back to the top, but everything really has to start, and end with the food safety component, and then certainly as we've talked about, the quality component of it too. In terms of what's trying to be achieved with the product that we're delivering as well, which goes again goes beyond the food safety elements as well.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because as consumers, we end up seeing these stories and we might hear about a recall or a listeria outbreak or, whatever it is that happens. Obviously, by the time it reaches the news, right, it's a really bad situation. And so we might look at that as consumers and almost glibly say, how did they let this happen again? When in fact, even just thinking about the labor component in a production facility, the level of complexity and the training and the regulations and inspections, everything that goes into making that possible, I think it's probably far more complex when you start to dig into it than sort of like a flash headline on the news gives you a sense of. And so I appreciate you joining me to talk about sort of what companies are doing, all of the different moving pieces that have to be addressed as companies are trying to ensure both safety and quality, and just giving us a sense of how that connects to some of the labor trends that are coming into play in this part of the supply chain.
Absolutely. Thanks for the time.
Sure. And Nathan, if people have joined me, they're interested based on what we've talked about, want to learn more about you or about what WorkForge does, what would be the best place for them to go?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go to our website, workforge.com, and it's a great resource, very, very detailed resource around our mission, what we're doing, who we work with, what our solutions are, and there's a great opportunity on there to connect with us or contact us or request a demo.
Excellent. Nathan, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you.